So there is just an ever-present now.
Ever present now. In fact, that's all there is. There are a series of now. And some physicists would say to you, in fact, Einstein, if he were here, and unfortunately he's not because he's a guy that I would love to talk to, and you're going to have to settle for me on your show instead of Einstein tonight, unfortunately, but I'll do my best to tell you what he would say. He would say, the idea of past and present and future is nothing but an illusion. Time doesn't flow. All time exists at the same. Now, what's really reassuring about that is all those moments that we remember from, especially of loved ones who are gone, maybe parents or unfortunately spouses or, God forbid, children who we have lost. And we think of those moments in the past, and we're sad when we think about them because they're gone. But in fact, they're not gone. Now, of course, we're not experiencing them at the moment, but they are no more gone than the moment right now when you and I are talking with each other. And these are very complicated topics to wrap your brain around. But what these things, and it's not really critical to understand all of this. What is critical to understand is that these things are real.
Right.
And I explain a lot more of them in the book, and they tell us that our world is a very strange place and nothing like we think it is.
And that is the theme, as you say, of the first half of your book, which is how we perceive things is not actually how they are. And scientifically, not spiritually. We're talking about fact. They are not how we think they are. And once you begin to confront one thing after another that is not actually how you think it is, it starts to play a little bit with your thinking of the larger questions. You also discuss in this first half the idea that we create our own reality. Another fascinating aspect of what's been learned in physics is this idea that we change things by observing them. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, and it's a complicated topic, but I'm going to give you an example. And without going into a treatise on quantum physics that makes everybody turn off their radio, and I don't want to do that to you, Tommy, because I'm sure you don't want me to chase your listeners away. But I'll give an example. Imagine a football game between the Minnesota Vikings, since you're in Minnesota, and the Dallas Cowboys. And if the game is televised and people are in the stadium, Minnesota wins. If, on the other hand, nobody watches the game, the stadium is empty, and there's no television, the Dallas Cowboys win. Now, that's a crazy idea, but in fact, that's what happens in physics. We know from studying quantum physics that if you want to know where a particle is, like an electron, electrons are a really tiny little particle. If you want to know where it is, you figure, well, we'll just use some kind of fancy electronics and big microscope or whatever it is, and we'll figure out where it is. But you can't figure out where it is because it's really everywhere at the same time. And people's eyes roll back in their heads and say, what are you talking about? It's only when you actually try and figure out where that electron is that it actually has a definite position. The rest of the time, it just has a probability of being somewhere. And that probability is anywhere in the universe. What this physics teaches us, again, it's not important to understand the physics. What it teaches us is that there's something bizarre about the world. Observation of an event changes the outcome. So, of course, the football game I told you is kind of silly because that doesn't happen in our real world. But in fact, in physics and in the world that we don't pay attention to every day, observation does matter. What this tells us is that, again, our world is very bizarre. The observing of an event changes the outcome. I'll tell you something even crazier from quantum physics. The future, we know this from detailed experiments, that the future can affect not only the past, and not only the present, but also the past. We just assume that the past affects the present affects the future, and everything goes in one direction. But as it turns out, and again we know this from physics, that the future has an effect on the past. There's an article, I think, I think it was Discover Magazine or Scientific American just recently about this exact thing. So these are very bizarre concepts. Again, not important to understand the physics behind it, but to accept the fact that we live in a strange world. And when you change your assumptions about a problem, then your conclusions change. I have a quick example in the book of a young girl who lives in a neighborhood, and she has to be in the house by 6 o'clock every night. And she doesn't know that at 6 o'clock every night, all the little girls in her neighborhood that don't have to be home at 6 go to the park in good weather and play. She also thinks that everybody butters both sides of their bread because that's what her family does, and she also thinks everybody drinks milk for breakfast. She doesn't know that a billion people might drink drink tea for breakfast. She doesn't know these things because she is not aware of them. So her world, to her, is everybody butters both sides of the bread, everybody drinks milk for breakfast, everybody's in the house by 6 o'clock. That's how it is with our world. Because we don't understand and haven't been exposed to the bizarre nature of our world, we have incorrect assumptions about how the world works. Once you start to understand that there are some very strange things at play in this world, like time, like the idea that observation changes reality, or in fact that each of us creates reality, like the fact that the future can affect the present and the past, you begin to open your mind to saying, wow, what else don't I know?
Right.
What else is going on? And that's where we end at the first half of the book, that I hope I've convinced the reader that this is not my opinion. This is
Right.
the way the world is.
Right. And you do a wonderful job of setting that up. After the break, we'll get to the second half of the book, and here's where I find your book, The Currency of Life, unique. I don't know anybody out there who's written a book set up the way you just set it up, who then concludes where you conclude. I think there are plenty of people who have written in ways that sound a lot like what we've heard so far. Rarely have I seen them then go to where you go next. And I'll leave it there until after the break. I'm speaking with Mark Klein, Dr. Mark Klein. He has written a book, The Currency of Life, Uncovering the Clues to Why We're Here. Stick around, more after this break. Prior to the break, we set up the first half of the book. In the second half, Mark, you get at some issues that are a little more palatable. For instance, the idea that no matter what goals we set, no matter what money we make, no matter what we achieve, in the end, we give it all up as we croak. We don't take it with us. What the hell's the point of that? Death is the great equalizer. All of us end the same way. And at some point, it seems rather silly to spend 78, 79 years, whatever our current life expectancy is, amassing some great wealth when we just all end up in the same place as the pauper anyway.
It is peculiar, isn't it? That mortality is still 100% among humans. Doesn't matter who you are, what you've done. So that by itself is an enormous clue. Death is something we just take for granted, and yet it's just as normal as lunch. You know, everybody has lunch every day. We don't make a big deal out of it, right? But we make a big deal out of death. It's of course it sounds like I'm being flip, but it is true. That's what happens. And so that clue, which I think is the most important clue at all when you start to really look into it, points us in a direction towards what life can't be about, and after that, a little more introspection, what life is about.
So we talked about this idea that we keep repeating the same mistakes generation after generation. We keep having to learn all over again. We have despots running the show 500 years ago. We have despots running the show today. We have genocide 1,000 years ago. We have genocide today. We advance to these sophisticated societies like Germany in the 1930s, a society of poets and scientists and philosophers. We still end up with a Holocaust. On top of all this, no matter what we do with our life, it ends the same way, with us rotting in some grave. So you conclude what?
Well, let's stick with death for a minute, because
All right.
I think a lot of people, you know, their ears kind of perk up when they hear about death. And I'll tell you something that I know to be true. And and again, let me just preface this by saying I am a skeptic. You know, I am not a person who reads a specific religious text and that's good enough for me, or listens to a pastor or some religious leader and says that's good enough for me. I'm a skeptic. I'm a science guy. It's just the way I'm wired. And so for me to come to these conclusions, it's almost been a fight the entire way, because I want to believe that the world is random. I want to believe that death is final. I wanted to believe that it's just the Big Bang occurs and then the rest is just a science experiment. But I also have to be a scientist and be objective and say I can't ignore the clues. So when it comes to death, I am absolutely convinced after all this that death isn't anything like we think it is. In fact, death is nothing to fear. one interesting point is you can't really evaluate what death is until you evaluate what life is. Death is, in a sense, the absence of life. So until we figure out what life is all about, it's hard to know what death is all about. But I will kind of jump to the end a little bit, because I think it's important for people to know and to be comforted by the fact that death is not as big a deal as we think it is. Death is nothing to be afraid of. And I am also totally convinced that death is not the end. Again, this doesn't come from a religious background, although I did grow up in religious school and read all the scriptures and so on. That's not where this comes from. This comes from an analysis of clues that have really literally beaten me into submission.
Okay, and let's talk about what those clues are, in particular in regard to life after death.
You know, I can't tell people any more than you can, Tommy, what happens after death, although I can look at something. I'll give you an analogy I use. As a doctor, you have to go to college for 4 years and get very good grades so you can get into medical school, and then after medical school, you're going to do anywhere between 3 and 7 or 8 more years of training. It's a long, long time. So imagine a doctor going through, all of that training, and 12, 15 years in some cases, and having somebody say to you, okay, well, well done, you passed all the tests, you did a great job. Now, not only are we going to give you a diploma, and a license, we're going to give you a stipend, we're going to give you a house, going to give you a car, you're all done, forget it. That's kind of how I look at life. Life is, at the very minimum, at the very basics, an incredible education. Here's an interesting idea for you, and I think I'm sure you remember this from the book, that we start out as infants completely ignorant. We know nothing. And in fact, we don't really get smart for a long, long time, certainly not as teenagers, certainly not as young adults, not to offend anybody. It's just the way it is. And in fact, we're pretty much the smartest near the end as long as we keep our faculties and don't develop dementia. That's when we're the smartest. That's when we have the most knowledge. And yet, that's the time it's least valuable. By the time you get to 75, maybe you'll get 25 years, it's possible, but most people won't. So wouldn't it make a lot more sense if we got smarter in the beginning? Most animals takes them about a year or less, and they reach their maturity, and they learn how to hunt for food and protect themselves and, keep out of danger, and that's it. But not us. We keep learning the whole way. It's an incredibly long education. It's literally endless. And yet, that's it. Once we finally become useful, as when we get to be seniors or near towards the end of our life, when we really have some wisdom and value, that's it? That's all we have to do? I don't think so. I think the story of life after death is, in my mind, a lot less like heaven than it is like a really good job. In fact, I like to think of what happens after death as the best job you ever have.